I welcome you again to my YouTube channel where I explore ancient texts, and the ancient texts that I explore in this channel are texts that have been around for thousands of years. At the moment, I'm reading Livy's books. This is a collection of books. They are generally called From the Founding of the City or The History of Rome. So this is a collection of books. There are very many books. Some are lost. Many are still available to be read, and I'm reading the ones that are available. And this collection of books covers the history of Rome from the founding of Rome, the city, which happened around 750s BCE or maybe 740s BCE. And the story goes on. Livy covers the history of Rome from that point to the time when Augustus was emperor, which was close to 0 AD. So we can say a period of about 700 years. Now, during this period, the one thing that stands out throughout the books is what has come to be known as the conflict of the orders, or sometimes called the struggle of the orders. And what this is the fight that was happening between two classes of the citizens of Rome. And these are the plebeians and the patricians. Now, in the city of Rome, there were, we will say, three categories of people. There were the patricians, and the patricians were the descendants of the people who had appointed to be senators. The seat of a senator was hereditary. Once a family got one seat, they continued holding that seat. A son will leave it to the son, a father will leave it to the son will leave it to the grandson, and so on and so forth. Now, the second category of people who, the citizens you can call them, were the plebeians. Now, the plebeians were the rest. Not really the rest, because there's another category of people that lived in the city. But these were the other. Okay, the citizens were patricians and the plebeians. The others were not really citizens. Now, the plebeians were citizens. They were free people, born free, and they were full citizens, but they were not patricians, and they could not qualify to hold public office, at least initially, and I'm going to talk about this as we go along. Now, the other category of people who lived in the Roman Republic, not really, let me not use the word republic, but because it was not always a republic, it was the slaves. Now, the slaves, of course, were born slaves, and they will live to be slaves, and their own children will become slaves. Now, the slaves in Rome did not have any rights. Even during the time of the Republic, they did not have much rights. I would say maybe they had some rights, of course, but not as the plebeians and the patricians. So we can say in the Roman society, there was this hierarchy of the social hierarchy. The patricians were at the top, and then there were the plebeians, and then the slaves at the bottom. Now, the struggle, or the so-called conflict of the orders, was the conflict that was happening between the patricians and the plebeians. Now, let's go back and see where this conflict started. In this video, we are going to look at the beginning of this conflict and the particular issues that caused this conflict between the plebeians and the patricians. Now, when Romulus founded Rome around 750s BCE, according to Livy, of course, and other writers who, of course, say that Rome was founded by Romulus, there were no classes, basically, because Rome was founded by shepherds. And these shepherds came from another city that used to be called Alba Longa. Now, Alba Longa was a city that had been founded by a group of people who came to be known as the Latins, and the Latins was a combination of an aboriginal tribe of people who lived in the Italian peninsula and a group of migrants who came from Troy, and they came to that land, and then they mingled with this, or they merged with this local tribe that was led by a guy who went by the name Latinus. Now, the guys from Troy were led by a guy who went by the name Aeneas. Now, Aeneas and Latinus joined together, and they formed this group. And when Latinus is killed at a battle with another tribe, then Aeneas decides to call this new group of the local aboriginal tribe and the Trojans, he called them the Latins. Now, the Latins are the ones who founded the city of Alba Longa. Now, Romulus himself and his brother Remus were descendants of the marriage that happened between the daughter of Latinus and Aeneas. And that family ruled Alba Longa for maybe 100 or over 100 years. I think 300 years. I was trying to do the estimates. According to records, of course, that exist, nobody can be so sure about that. But according to the records that exist, could have been around 300 years before Romulus was born. And that family ruled Alba Longa. Now, Romulus and Remus came from Alba Longa, and as I've said, they belong to the family that ruled over that city. And when they left Alba Longa, they left with a group of shepherds. And there's a story behind this. I've talked about it in another video. They left with a group of shepherds, mostly male, of course, and they go and they start this new city. Of course, before the city is founded, Romulus kills his brother Remus. And this city is founded, and initially it is only shepherds, male shepherds, and so there was no class. The class was one. It was only shepherds. And in fact, these people were most of these people, aside from Romulus and his brother, the rest were like at the bottom of the citizens of Alba Longa when they left. So there was just this one group of people. Now, when when the city of Rome is established, then there is a problem of they don't have women. And Livy tells us of this story of Romulus tricking the neighboring tribes and towns to come to a festival that they had organized, and then they used that festival to kind of they basically grabbed women who came and made them their wives, and then that's how now Rome was able now to continue having kids basically, and of course continuing to grow. Now, from that point, as described, there were no classes. It was just Romans with their king, of course, Romulus. But then Romulus decided from very early on, in fact, one of the first things he did, or one of the first steps he took, was to appoint a group of people to help him govern the city. And these were the senators. And he appointed these people from among these shepherds, in fact. So there was nothing really that differentiated them from the rest. Maybe he looked at some of them and they were maybe more capable than the rest, but there was nothing like to say that they belonged to a different social class and that's why they were picked to be senators. They were just picked because maybe as individuals they showed some kind of capability. Now, these senators became senators for life. And when they died, their kids took up the seats and they became senators. And that's how the class of patricians were basically born. And later on, the kings who came after Romulus did appoint more senators. And the last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, did kill almost all the senators, almost eliminating them. But then when he was expelled, and now Rome became a republic, and now instead of kings, we had consuls ruling. The very first consuls, who were Junius Brutus and Collatinus, they appointed more people from the community, of course, to become senators, and they made the number, I think, either 100 or 300. And now these senators are the ones who formed the patrician class. And their kids became, or their families became, the patrician class. So when you look at the origins of the patrician class, there's nothing unique that made them different. They were not even ethnically different from the rest of the Romans. In fact, most of the patricians, they came from different tribes. Some were Latins, some were Sabines. For example, Appius Claudius, who I talked about in my previous video, was a Sabine. And but you will also find the plebeians who were also from Sabine, even slaves. In fact, there was a guy who went by the name Appius Herdonius, who led a revolt by slaves at some point, and he was a Sabine like Appius Claudius. So there was nothing really ethnically that differentiated the patricians from the plebeians and even from the slaves. But over time, the patrician class decided that they were different from the rest of the Romans. And in fact, they even came up with these laws that banned patricians and plebeians from intermarrying. And so for a very long time, they were not intermarrying. Now, when the kings were expelled, that's Lucius Tarquinius Superbus and his family, and now we have Rome becoming a republic, that's when the actual conflict of the order started. Before the expulsion of the kings, there was nothing, according to what Livy writes, at least, there was no conflict between the patrician families and the plebeian families. Not to the extent that it was important to record or to write about, but the actual conflict started almost immediately after the expulsion of the king. Now, and this was around 500 BCE. Now, when the king leaves, we have the very first major issue. And the major issue, now I'm going to talk about several issues that basically we will say points of contention, if you might call them. So the first issue was on interest rates. Most of the patrician families, or many of the patrician families, were engaged in the business of money lending, and they used to loan this money at very high interest rates, and by so doing they ended up enslaving many of the plebeian people, because if you are unable to pay, then what happened, they will take you and you become a slave. And the plebeians were not slaves, these were free people. But now, if you are unable to pay your debts, you are taken and you become the slave of the person who had lent you money. Now, that became the first issue, and it became a really big issue. And in fact, it made the plebeians to refuse to join the army to fight the wars that were going on between the Romans and other tribes. And they had to be promised that once the war was over, the issue was going to be looked at, and then the interest rates were going to be taken care of. But that turned out to be an empty promise. Once the wars were over, the plebeians realized that nothing was done, and they continued being made slaves. And this led to what came to be known as the cessation of the plebs, which happened, according to records that are available, happened around 494 BCE. And this is when all the plebeians decided, because the patricians have refused to look at our issue regarding the interest rates, we are going to leave the city, all of us, and leave the city to them. And they left, and they went to what Livy calls the Sacred Mount. And they stayed there and for a while. And in fact, the patricians started getting worried, because now the city was unprotected, and they fear that other tribes will come and attack, or the plebeians could come back and overpower them. And they sent one guy who went by the name Agrippa Menenius Lanatus to go and negotiate with these people. And he goes, he talks to them, and the plebeians were led by a guy who went by the name Sicinius, and they talked to them, and then an agreement is reached. And the agreement was the plebeians were going to be allowed to elect what came to be known as the tribunes of the people, and these were kind of like their representatives, and their work was to protect the rights of the plebeians. Now, this office existed for almost 500 years or 600 years. It existed for a very long time, and for a very long time it was the only office that a plebeian could hold. The rest of the offices it was almost assumed that only the patricians were qualified to hold those offices. So the first issue was the interest rates. Then, of course, the second issue became the issue about this belief that the plebeians could not hold any other office, including the office of the consul and dictator and other offices, including protua, as they were called, or praetor, or sensuals. So these offices were only filled by the patricians, and initially the plebeians didn't really have an issue with it, but as time went by, they started questioning as why was it that they could not hold these offices. And this again became an issue that became very polarizing between the two groups, and they fought, including physical fights sometimes at the forum. And of course, later on, laws were changed, and they were allowed to become consuls. And they, in fact, later on, we did have consuls who were plebeians, and we did have dictators who were plebeians. But there's something I read that was so interesting, and it is the propaganda that the patricians were giving out regarding the ability of the plebeians to lead. And they had made this belief, or they had impacted this belief in the minds of the people, including the plebeians themselves, that they were not, they didn't have the ability to lead because they were not born with it, and only patricians were born with this ability and the blessings from the gods as well. So that was another issue, but over time, the plebeians were allowed to become dictator, to become, in fact, the first dictator was a guy by the name Gaius Marcius Rutilus, 356 BCE, sorry. And then we had consuls, censors who were plebeians, and over time, the society came to accept that even the plebeians could become, could hold public office aside from, could hold public office in addition to the tribune of the people. Now, another issue was the issue which came to be known as the Agrarian law. And this became an issue for almost 30 or 50 years, and the plebeians and the patricians were fighting over this law. And in fact, it is this law that led to, it was during the contention about this law that we come to know of Cincinnatus, who's the city of Cincinnati in the US is named after. His son, Queso, was leading a band of young people from the patricians class who were going around and beating up the plebeians who were in meetings trying to push for the adoption of this law. And this law became a major issue for a very long time. And at the end of it, Livy doesn't really tell us whether it was ever adopted. The law itself was about the distribution of land. As things were, the patricians always got the first priority to get the best land and maybe bigger pieces of land than the plebeians. And the plebeians didn't like that. They also wanted to own land, and this law was about that. And for almost 50 years, they fought about this law. It was very contentious, and yeah, so that was an issue. The other interesting issue that the plebeians and the patricians were fighting over was the issue of intermarriage. Now, since the beginning up until when maybe it was around 350s BCE, if I'm not wrong, there was no actual law that banned patricians and plebeians from intermarrying, but they used not to intermarry. It was just like an unwritten law that the patricians and the plebeians could not intermarry. So that went on, and everybody accepted it. Nobody questioned it. But then at some point, the laws were being changed, and they appointed a group of 5 known as the decemvirs, who I mentioned in my previous video. And a law was actually written to ban it. And that became now an issue for the plebeians. Even though they were not really intermarrying with the patricians before, but when it was made law, they were very uncomfortable with it. And this became an issue, and they started fighting over this. And they started trying to pass laws that will allow intermarriage between the patricians and the plebeians. And at some point, the patrician tricked the plebeians so that they gave them something else, so that this law is not abolished. They allowed them to be appointed into an office of a military tribune, which they created so that they don't push for this law. But later on, the two groups increasingly started intermarrying and coming together, but it was still not really accepted, because there is a story that Livy tells us which happened much later in time, maybe around 270s BCE, when a lady who came from the patrician class had been married by a plebeian, and the plebeian was a very successful guy in the military. He held a high office, but he was denied to join the women of the patrician class who were going to the temple to perform some rituals. And then it became also an issue, because now she was like, I belong in the patrician class. Yes, I'm married to a plebeian, but I have the right to join women from the patrician class in performing these rituals. And that became another smaller issue, though not like the others, but it was an issue that had to be discussed in the Commonwealth. Now, so those are the major issues that they were fighting over. Mostly it was about money, land, intermarriages, and offices, public offices. So these were the main issues that these two groups were fighting over. The trend, though, is that slowly the plebeians kind of like became the winners. even towards the end of the Republic, when now Rome becomes an empire, the plebeians had gotten a lot of, you will say they had won a lot of battles with the patricians. The patricians had lost a lot of their control. And in fact, at some point, some patrician families, it reached a point where some patrician families found it okay to start identifying themselves as plebeians, or to start doing their politics on the side of the plebeians. In general, this conflict of the orders went on from the time that Rome became a republic, which was around 500 BCE, and kind of like we can say it ended in the late or somewhere in 200 BCE. By the time Rome is becoming an empire, the two groups had basically, it was not a big, the difference between them was no longer that huge. So if you enjoyed what I'm talking about here, please feel free to like the video. And if you have any questions or something came up in your mind as I was explaining something, feel free to leave me comments below. See you in the next video.